Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Future Governance Forum event to launch their new report, Into Power, Lessons from Australia and the USA. My name's Anoosh Chakelian. I'm Britain editor of the New Statesman magazine and host of the New Statesman podcast, and I'll be chairing our panel today. For those of you who don't know, the Future Governance Forum is a new, progressive, non-profit and non-partisan think tank whose aim is to provide the intellectual and practical infrastructure vital to national renewal and the revival of progressive government in the UK. In a general election year, as we assume we're in, it's crucial to start thinking about how the country can operate differently at a national, devolved, regional and local level. And how can a new government develop and implement new models of partnership, policy development and service delivery? With Labour predicted by the polls to take power from the Conservatives, we could be about to experience just the third transition of power from one party to another in 40 years in the UK. Getting this process right is crucial to any new government's ability to deliver on its promises and govern in the way it intends. So to shine a light on how to develop an effective transition, FGF has looked overseas to recent examples of conservative to progressive transitions in the United States and Australia. And I'm delighted to be joined by our excellent panel of speakers to give us more of an insight into how this process works. Tom Collinge, author of this report, a policy associate at FGF and head of policy and communications at Progressive Britain. Ben Hubbard, former chief of staff to Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard, with experience of the most senior levels of government, now principal at Creswell Advisory, joining us from Melbourne. Josie Kluwer, former special advisor in Gordon Brown's government, who was part of the opposition's preparation for government steering group in 2015, and now a partner at EY and founding member of the Skills Task Force for Global Britain. And Valerie Smith-Boyd, who leads the Partnership for Public Services efforts to support transition planning by presidential candidates and their teams, most recently supporting the Biden-Harris transition in 2020, joining us from Washington, DC. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. I know it's nearly 11 p.m. your time, Ben, so we really appreciate that. I'm going to come to Tom first to talk us through the headlines of the report, before asking Ben, Josie and Valerie for their reflections on the issues it raises. And then we'll open out to a discussion and some questions from the audience as well. So start thinking of your questions while our panelists are speaking and put them into the Q&A function whenever you like, and I'll keep an eye on them. And we'll be wrapping up by 1 p.m. So Tom, over to you.
Great, thanks Anoosh. I just wanted to kick off my remarks today by thanking Adam Terry, Sarah Mully and Daria Ben-Galim, who helped make this report a reality, as well as Nathan and Bruno at the FGF, who kind of steward it so professionally through production, and also to thank the rest of the panel, who are kind of serious heavyweight transition experts who've often been through these things firsthand, whereas I am merely a researcher. We wrote this paper because we're invested in the next government being a success. If it's going to be Labour, they've got the dual challenge of not having made a transition for a long time, and also proposing a fundamentally new way of doing government to what has come before, the mission-based approach. The planning that takes place in a transition is going to be key to making any of that work. So that's why we look to our colleagues in Australia and the US to learn as much as we could. In the time that I've got, I'm not going to try and cover everything that's in the paper, just give you a bit of an overview and what I think is most important. It's a very long paper. It's taken a while to come together, and that's because transition is a big, baggy beast. And in the UK and in Australia, it's kind of shrouded in secrecy. It's got both formal and informal components, but it's all part of the same process. So what might start over someone's kitchen table years out from an election is part of a stream of activity that eventually includes formal access talks with the civil service and eventually delivery of the government's first 100 days agenda. There's a lot of individual tasks involved with transition, and for my money, the two most important are defining what kind of government an incoming opposition wants to be, its agenda and its style, and staffing that government, so personnel. And I think these two things, and I hope it comes out in the report, are quite tightly related. This is easiest to see in the US, where transition is a huge and kind of transparent business, and appointments and what they mean for an incoming administration, say staffing, are the subject of a lot of scrutiny and speculation. But if we understand the relationship between the kind of questions of style, substance, and people, it's probably the easiest way for us in the UK to start to see transition for what it really fundamentally is, which is a political activity. I think we tend not to think of it like this. We tend to see the questions defining what a government is in one box as this political thing, and transition as this largely administrative thing, maybe focused around access and jobs. And we see it like that because it's sort of true. In Labour, policy is set democratically, style and agendas are set by political leaders. But I mean, first off, it would be a mistake to assume that politicians dealing with the demands of their roles and the campaign trail have had much space to think through what kind of government they want to be part of or what kind of department they want to lead. As we see in the paper, especially in Australia, things aren't as simple as that. And asking these questions as part of a transition can help define what a government will be. And yes, policy is set through the party's processes, but how policy is delivered is also just as important. And that depends on the minister and it depends on the staff that they've got working on delivery. So that's the link. A government is made up of people. Staffing it is not the same as a corporate HR task. It defines what kind of government it will be. It's an intrinsically political act. So there's one thing I hope we can convince you of in the paper, it's that there's no way for a transition not to be political. The kind of reticence to acknowledge this in the UK conversation comes in different forms. The one that we tackle most fully in the paper actually comes from kind of inverted commas political people themselves, I guess, who are campaigners, is probably a better way of putting it. And it should be quite familiar to most UK people who are on the call today. It's the accusation of being seen to measure the curtains. So it's regularly slung at politicians who are seen to be making the most kind of prosaic of administrative preparations for government. Stuff that I think we would all agree that it's responsible for anybody thinking about forming the government of a nation to do. But it's also incredibly corrosive to campaigns, and campaigning people hate these kind of accusations with good reason. I don't think that this paper is going to kind of change a lot of minds on the idea that being seen to measure curtains is a bad thing. It almost certainly is. But I do want to highlight that what we've learned from our kind of brothers and sisters around the world is that where conditions have allowed it, especially in the US, being seen to prepare for government in public has actually been a political asset. So when Biden's transition was able to brief out that it would be a government reflective of the American people, it was able to do that because it had set itself stringent diversity targets as part of the transition process. We do actually have a domestic example here with the appointment of Sue Gray, which was part of a Labour is taking preparation for government seriously narrative that at the very least didn't hurt the party. We set out a few more things that Labour could do in public in the paper. My favourite is be more open in how it recruits to political roles to signal the kind of government it might want to be. And there's more that I can say on the relationship to the campaign, the role of leadership, the kind of processes that are involved and the tasks of doing a transition. But hopefully we'll get to that stuff in the course of the conversation. So in summation, what we've learned from our colleagues around the world is that transition is political, transition is about people, and getting it right is vital to the success of an incoming government. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was great. And I would love to hear Ben's reflections first, and then we'll go on to Josie and Valerie. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Anush. And I'm dialing in from the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne. Can I pay my respects to their elders past and present? Land was never ceded here in Melbourne. And certainly the Australians, there might be a few there, would acknowledge that connection that they have. Look, the report does align with my experiences and insights, and I was really pleased to be one of the Australians that the crew talked to in preparing the report. And I suppose I'll just go along with Tom's point and just continue on it about transitions are political. It's one of the themes, but I think it's the biggest theme. The politics of the day and the politics of tomorrow, and political leadership specifically, is what drives the choices that governments make as they go in. And it brings to life the political offer. Opposition's promised many things, but the formation of government and how you do that is bringing to life that offer. It's a political offer. It's also judged in small p and harshly capital P political frames too. So it's not just there to deliver on the politics, it's judged through a frame of politics, but it's not just political. The differences, like there are some really significant similarities between the Australian and UK systems. There's some differences too. I think one thing that makes transition harder in the UK is a lack of a sharp apex at the top of government. In Australia, there's a Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, which is run by a single secretary, a single civil servant. It's got a very specific role in the change of government, and it has some command and control features for that period as well. And I think there's it's a very helpful set of arrangements. The second difference would be, and it's a contemporary one, that when Labor won government in Australia about 18 months ago, in the middle of 22, that new cabinet, the inner cabinet's 23 people, 14 had been federal ministers before. It was a very experienced cabinet. And of the other 9, a number of them had significant political experience in government. So, for instance, one of them being a chief minister of the ACT and another had been a New South Wales minister. Even with that experience, all of the ministers, so all 42 of the ministry, went for an induction process, a formal induction process, which was done early in the life of the government. I think the risks with a government that's 100 strong, where I don't think there's a history or a feature of doing such things with a 100 strong government, with very few of them having experience as ministers, is something which presents a really different risk profile for the incoming government as well. I think it's probably enough from me, Anush. We're on to the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was really helpful. And on to Josie.
Thanks very much, Anush, and thanks for having me. And also, thanks for not mentioning the obvious that in 2015, of course, all the preparation for government that was done obviously never got put into practice. But the team was ready, and I think we were ready because, as others have said, the political decision that recognised the importance of being ready and gave focus and space for that activity to happen, albeit kind of out of the way of the campaign, but that activity was happening. So a few reflections from me on the what, the how, and the who. So on the what, this sounds really obvious, but being really clear about what you actually want to achieve in government is really important. And in 2015, we spent a lot of time working in the centre and with the shadow teams on what are the priorities for each department and what are the priorities overall, and in what order is the first 24 hours, first 100 days, first Queen's speech, etc., etc. And of course, I think there's a natural tension between the preparation team, who want to get all of that nailed down super early so that they can do access talks and all of the rest of it, versus the campaign team, who probably want to hold strategic ambiguity for as long as they can. And actually, we used activities like the access talks to really clarify and do the planning around what the priorities really were, and let's say iterate that as we went. The second bit on the how, and I think I really agree with what Tom was saying about this being the most important thing, is, and it sounds a bit grand, but it's, what is your view about how change happens in the country, and what is the role of central government in making that happen? And in 2015, we reflected a lot. There was a joke that everybody made about the Blair era, which was, you wanted to get GPs to change something, you would write them a letter on the back of a check. And, in 2015, it was really clear to us that, you couldn't just throw money at a problem. You also, if Ed were going to be elected at all, he was going to have a small majority, if at all. Therefore, you can't legislate your way through making change happen. So actually thinking through, okay, so what are the levers that you're going to pull as a central government, and how does that affect change in the country, and what does that mean for your relationship with local government, civic society, business, etc., feels really important, and I think exciting in the UK at the moment, because there's a big idea about missions and bringing civil society into government with the Labour Party and all of that, and forthcoming FGF paper on mission-led government. And of course that leads you into the WHO, and being really clear about what jobs are needing to be done and who is going to do which job. And obviously that is fraught with difficulty, but important to get right, because in the UK, as soon as the election is won or lost, the team walks into government, which is obviously different to friends around the world. And you know, in 2015, what that meant was there was a whole bunch of people who were trained, who were ready, who were kind of, you know, warmed up on the racetrack, and of course, you know, never got to implement the plans. But much better that, I think, than the alternative. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Josie. And lastly, Valerie.
Thanks, Anoush, and I just want to commend Tom and the Future Governance Forum for putting together this work. I would highlight 3 themes from the report, starting with one of Tom's points about how important it is to break the taboo on the importance of transition planning. Here in our context, we talk about the trillions of dollars, the millions of employees, the hundreds of federal agencies. It really, but as Josie just said, the fact that you win the election and you step right in, this is a complicated task in any context, and it really requires early planning. And we feel since 2008, we've helped change the conversation a bit about measuring the drapes, but it's still an ongoing process. So having this conversation is really important in the first place. I would also highlight the personnel themes from the report. The people that you hire to enact your vision is the most critical part of enacting the vision. And particularly after a long break in governance, it's really important to find people who have the good managerial skill set, who are really able to take an initiative and drive it forward, and understand the substance of what's required in those agencies to make it happen. In the report, you talk a bit about assembling a network of experts as you're doing here. I would suggest too, thinking about a sort of bipartisan, nonpartisan network of experts. There are not the universe of people who have thought about these issues is not really that large, and it helps to kind of work across parties, across groups to see where the best practices have been before. Also, training those new folks to be familiar with the central government environment and what's different about budgeting and processes and working across departments and agencies. The last thing I would highlight is the process theme in the report, that it is so important, as you've done, to take a separate group to focus on these issues. The campaigns or the candidates, the leaders are very busy with their defining the political agenda, and having a group of people who are separately focused and separately resourced on implementing that agenda is very necessary. And I'm sure we'll talk through the course of this about how to create connectivity between those efforts on the political side. But I commend you on breaking the taboo and starting this conversation.
Thank you so much, Valerie, and thanks everyone for your input. And I'm glad that you used the word taboo, Valerie, because that was going to be my first question. Tom mentioned it's a sort of bit of a secretive process, and I'm sure a lot of our audience will know a lot about the party's campaigns and about the need for certain retail policies towards a certain time in the electoral cycle, but they might never have heard that much about these plans for transition. And I wonder whether or not it would be beneficial for the UK to one day look at formalising the process in law like you have in the US, to avoid both this secrecy, but also perhaps to capitalise on the potential political benefits of being a bit more open, as Tom mentioned, and also to try and ease those tensions between the campaign team and those who are doing the access talks and preparing for transition that Josie mentioned. So I wondered, Valerie, if you could reflect on that, given your US perspective. And just before that, if the audience could start thinking of your questions and sending them in, please do, because I will open out to the floor.
So I would agree that formalizing the process through some sort of laws and regulations is a good practice. I'll do 2 tiny bits of history and say back in 1963, President Kennedy on our side realized that that presidential candidates needed some support. Had Congress pass a Presidential Transition Act that provided a bit of funding for elected candidates, office space, and it's grown in the amount of funding and IT support. But really not a lot had happened for very long. And after 2000, when we had a Supreme Court decision that needed to decide the election results, a long delay that kind of shortened the transition period. And then in 2020, seeing that a lot of the expectations were really based, even after legal changes, strengthening and putting more procedures in place, there's still a lot that is based on norms and traditions and attitudes of the people involved. And so to the greatest extent possible, to have things like bodies, different agencies representing ethics, records, background investigations, the kinds of operations that need to take place in advance to get people ready, getting procedures like that codified and planned. Another change that we made was kind of creating memorandums of understanding between outgoing and incoming candidates teams on information sharing. I think in this context, it's a lot more immediate, and so maybe that is less relevant. But the ways of kind of codifying information sharing in advance are really helpful to get the new party running quickly.
Brilliant. Thank you, Valerie. Who wants to come in on this idea of formalizing the process? I mean, Tom and Josie, I'd love to hear from you about whether you think that would just sort of be a fundamentally un-British thing for us to do here.
I mean, personally, I think there are huge benefits if one can achieve that, but I think achieving it is incredibly hard. And like Valerie says, it has to be a bipartisan process. It's not something that any one party can really unilaterally do. But that said, I mean, there's things in the report that parties can do even in the absence of a formal process to kind of formalize their internal processes around preparing for transition. And I think the most important one, which again, Valerie has touched on, is trying to create a really hard delineation between the transition and the campaign people. In the States, they're legally distinct organizations, even if they kind of feed into some of the leaders at the top. And I have not been involved in this process domestically, and Josie has obviously, so I'll defer to her. But I can imagine the pressure for resources inside an opposition party must be actually gigantic. So kind of informally formalizing who's working on what and protecting them. And a lot of that comes down to leadership as well, which is another key theme of the report. If the leader takes the transition seriously and is involved in it, then those two teams will have, if not parity of esteem, then like parity of ability to be effective. So it's quite short version. I think formalization of the process in the UK, quite unlikely, certainly in the short term, but formalization of the process within parties, lots of potential.
Right. And Ben, you want to come in?
Yeah, I might just give an Australian example. Last election, so our elections are on a Saturday, so it's on Saturday 21st of May 2022. PM Morrison called it knowing that the meeting of the Quad, which is the multilateral entity between Australia, US, India and Japan, it's a significant multilateral event between the four leaders, was on the Tuesday after. Saturday, Tuesday. During the election period, they could brief, the public service could brief generally on the administrative arrangements, but couldn't actively do anything on the Quad. So literally Albanese gets elected Saturday night and he has to fly to Japan on the Monday night, fully briefed to attend the Quad on behalf of Australia. Like an absolute poison pill act by Morrison. And there was no way for the Federal Public Service to talk to Albanese about said matters until they decided to engage a helpful consultant to advise them on what Prime Minister Albanese might need and the sort of resources and briefings he would require for the event, including COVID tests and other things like that, which are obviously mandatory at the time. Like it was just, to use that Australian term, of absolute dog's breakfast, because the institutional arrangements are old kit. They're 30 years old and don't contemplate these sorts of things.
Wow.
Anyway,
that is
he got on the plane as Prime Minister and was briefed by the time he hit Japan and did a good job, and in many ways created momentum. It wasn't Morrison's planned, but Albanese hit Japan, did a good job, and everyone went, oh, he was quite prime ministerial and did a good job. Well done, Albo.
Wow, thank you so much. That is an absolutely wild example. Thanks, Ben. Josie, do you want to come in on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, in what other area of life would that be sort of sensible or acceptable? You know, like if you were reading the business pages and somebody was, you know, showed up for their first day as CEO and you know, said, oh yeah, sorry, I mean, I haven't done any prep. Haven't done any practice. No, I haven't thought about it at all. You know, I mean, it's silly. It's silly. And you know, of course, I get the politics, but Ben, I think Ben's example is great. And then I guess just on the sort of formalization in the civil service, I mean, I think it's probably unlikely. And you know, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I think I might have been quite relaxed about it. But I think as politics gets more divided, the sort of good chap theory, which like runs quite a lot of the UK politics and our lovely unwritten constitution and convention and all the rest of it, I think you can't rely on people being good chaps. So, you know, maybe we should formalise more than we first thought.
Brilliant, thank you. And just thinking of Labour in particular, they've got this mission-led approach, which I'm sure you all have read about and seen in Tom's report as well. And that has the potential, I suppose, to be quite a point of tension in preparing for transition, given that the civil service, at least here, can be quite sceptical of sort of big machinery of government changes and doing things fundamentally differently. I wonder, you know, how you see Labour's challenge in embedding that mission-driven approach, and whether or not that comes into the transition planning stages, how far they have to plan for making that work. Tom, perhaps you could start.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fundamental. I mean, I have less interesting and insightful things to say about what machinery of government changes might be needed to make missions work, but to make for the transition component of making missions work, we only have to look at the Biden administration. So when the Biden transition team was briefing the various members, again, kind of tracking back to recruitment, they were given 4 crosscuts. And I was going to try and remember them off the top of my head, but I have failed to do that. They were economy, equity, COVID recovery, and climate change. So you're recruiting to a department, you might be recruiting to the Department of Energy or something like that for political advisors. And you have specific roles and duties that those people have to fulfill to be the right person for that job. But then you also have these 4 crosscuts, which are kind of like our 5 missions to help you differentiate between people and to help you understand the structure of those departments as well. So I said I wasn't going to talk about machinery of government changes, but I guess I kind of sort of slightly have to, because they will inform the way that you're setting up departments and people that might not necessarily be central to the mission as the way that the British Academy British establishment is currently set out. But in the planning process, if you're thinking about kind of DEFRA or something like that, you're also thinking about the green mission, you're also thinking about the growth mission, potentially you're also thinking about the opportunity mission. So it should inform the planning in quite substantive ways. I mean, how it actually cashes out will depend on what the missions are kind of currently looking like.
Yeah, Josie, do you want to come in? I saw you unmute there.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm generally pretty skeptical about machinery of government changes, just on the basis that they can be an enormous distraction from the day job. And also, my belief is that one of the biggest challenges with government is how it works between departments, and actually worrying about where you draw the vertical lines doesn't actually solve the how do you get the government to work horizontally together. But I think that's what missions are all about. And I think that the missions, so do I think they should worry too much about machinery of government in the sense of like departments? No. But do I think people should be really working through how do you operationalize missions and turn missions from what is at the moment a really strong comms tool into a delivery, how do we run the country tool? Absolutely. And I think this comes back to what I was saying about what theory of government, what is the role that central government plays in making change happen in the country? What is the role of local government? What is the role of civic society? What's the role of business, etc., etc.? And how do you then architect central government to enable all of that so that change happens out there in the big wide world? And my sense is that having a clear view about how you want to operationalize missions will be really important, because there's always the risk that without real clarity, they end up kind of being watered down by the system, which is no criticism of the system. It's just that's what systems do, right? So I think where I would be is thinking about the most radical, bold version of how you would run missions, because actually that's the way you make change happen in a big system, isn't it?
Really interesting. Thank you. Tom, sorry, you had your hand up.
Can I just jump back in, because what Josie said made me think of something, which is that as much as missions aren't like necessarily just supposed to be a comms thing, a new Labour government is going to have to show that it's different from previous governments. It's going to have to show that it's very committed to a new model of delivery. And that means it's going to have to do stuff, highly visible stuff around each of these missions in its first 100 days. So they are, in that sense, central to transition planning.
And Valerie, I'd love to hear from you on this. I mean, Tom laid out the Biden-Harris transition priorities. I mean, I know the civil service works differently in the US, but you know, what are the tensions there when you go in with these missions, particularly in terms of trying to get different departments to work together?
I do hope you'll forgive or correct me if I misunderstand any parallels between our contexts, but I do think I hear two big things in common. And one is issues are cross-cutting. Like in our world, everything is becoming more complicated and more integrated, and you can't think about security without thinking about the economy and international relations. And so one, as Tom said, it's really important not just to look at sort of an issue by issue or agency by agency review of how to enact your plans, but to think about the big picture and have people who are thinking about making the connections across different roles and responsibilities in different agencies, and creating a mindset in which those players will work together as part of a unified team in government. Secondly, and I think more directly to what you were asking, Anoush, there's a debate in the US now about the administrative state and the sort of responsiveness of the civil service to new political leadership. And so one way that I would answer that question is to say that it's really important for the new political leaders, as they step in, have the initial interviews with civil service leaders, is to really create that team environment, because everyone is people trying to accomplish a job. That is why they're there, and the civil service is bringing a continuity of experience and knowledge on the issues in each agency. And so for in our context, for the political leaders to form unified teams with the civil servants in each department, agency, office is really the magic recipe for getting things done.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Valerie. And Ben, I wonder what your reflections are on the challenges for Labour trying to implement this mission-led approach and ensure it's not watered down by the system, as Josie warned.
Look, they've got a big decision to make about the centre of government. Like I do think it's a pretty, ordinary model, the cabinet office and lack of clarity about the centre. Notwithstanding that, the mandate that they'll have, should they win, is a clear mandate to pursue those missions. It's really then what are the steps that a incoming PM and his team need to make to pursue them. So the first one is setting expectations with the civil services. This is the important stuff. It's not all things are equal. This is the important stuff. Secondly is doing that formally on day one. So I think, the conversation about how we're going to work and how we get things done, but also the formal, description of this is the important thing. I know you might think other things are important too, but this is the important thing to me. And then bringing that to life. So in Australia, there's a model called charter letters where the Prime Minister or the Premier writes to the ministers and said, these are your priorities for the term, these are the expectations, these are the general expectations, how you work, these are the integrity arrangements you'll make, and this is how you'll report on these specific priorities. And so that's the next thing. So you've got a set of reports from departments into the centre. They're working off the same baseline, the same description of programs. And then the accountability process that goes with that, not just who is accountable, which department or agency is accountable, but a cabinet committee process to light the torch, the flame torch, not the battery torch, and warm them up, right? To bring in the ministers and said, right, you're accountable for that half of mission 1. Where's it at? Tell me why. And then have in that the tempos and that cabinet committee to do the deep dives and to actually go in deep periodically into different parts and pull them apart and put back together again. So, and all those steps is what you do in other contexts, but it's the public sector version of that when you want to get something big done in a large organisation. Brilliant.
Thank you so much, Ben. And we've got some really good questions coming in, and please keep them coming in. I am keeping an eye on them. The first one is from John McTurnan. Thanks, John. He says that he wants to question the idea of transparency over political advisor appointments. So you've all mentioned the importance of decisions to be made on personnel. So I wonder what you make of John's question there. Who wants to come in first?
I'll take it, knowing because I know John. I can be firm and direct. Hello, John. So the proposition is one around the capacity to put an expression of interest. That if you're a health policy expert and lives in Darwin and interested in progressive ideas, but you're not a member of the Labor Party, how can I put my hand up to say I'm interested? And so there's a single place to go. The roles are clear. There's essentially a portal process like there are in other recruitment processes, and you put in your expression of interest and you're in the pot. We're at a pot of about 4,000 expressions of interest from all around the country. And from that pot, ministers can come in and go, I need a health policy advisor and I need them based in Canberra or Melbourne. And they've been pre-sorted and say, here are the 10 best health policy advisors in Melbourne or Canberra, because they've been pre-screened by a team of about 10 people, but they didn't have to. So if the ministers already knew who their health policy advisors were, they could go and recruit them direct, but it meant that that person was at least in the mix, or if they're willing to move to Melbourne or Canberra, they could. And so there was transparency about putting in an expression of interest, not about, in the end, what the minister did. The ministers had their own accountabilities, though, in that they couldn't just directly employ people. They had, as soon as they wanted to employ someone, they had to go through a central process where a couple of senior ministers and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff would actually review all the appointments before they could be made. And it was basically a checking exercise to ensure that people of appropriate stature and quality were being appointed, and that they'll fit for the job. So it was in many ways, it was a risk mitigation exercise. In Australia, the special advisor class, includes an administrative class too. It's about 500 jobs that have to be filled. And those 500 jobs were filled in the first 100 days of the Albanese government. So, but the transparency related to people being able to submit an expression of interest and what the jobs look like, but that was the extent of the transparency.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Ben. That was a really thorough answer. Thanks. And Tom, I mean, how much did the transparency question come into your report in terms of recruiting personnel?
Well, I mean, we took our cues. I mean, Ben set out the Australian position really clearly there. We took a lot of cues and had a lot of interest in what happens in the US, which is kind of like the what's Ben's described, but on steroids, a sort of national level expression of interest platform for the Biden-Harris campaign, running for almost a year. Had an afterlife after the transition, and was morphed into an opportunity for people who are interested in public service to express that interest. I mean, look, transparency is always something that's going to like make political people a little bit nervous. Like, we're not naive about this. This is like not how things work. I understand it's a very relational business, but I mean, Labour literally has an opportunity mission. It has an opportunity mission that has a class component, and it's very important, I think, or there's a lot of potential for the party to show that it's leading from the front, that it's kind of living its values, so to speak. So while these things always have to be balanced, I guess I would ask, what are we doing in the transition to show what we understand opportunity to mean? And things like these expressions of interest platforms are a great way of signaling that.
Great. Valerie, do you want to come in on the US side to that?
I do think we have a personnel process on steroids, and the Biden-Harris team had to organize to manage that challenge. And in our system, we have 4,000 political appointments, more than 1,200. We think it's actually more than 1,300 require Senate confirmation, but the accounting for them is actually pretty difficult. But it is. So you not only have the process to sort of vet and kind of test the skills of the advisors that are closest to you, but also send a lot of leaders through a very rigorous process of ethics and financial disclosures, and a fairly public review process with hearings. And our challenge has been that the massive growth in the number of positions requiring confirmation over the last 70 years has meant that it is almost mathematically impossible for presidents to get people through that process in the first year or two, or even 3. And clearly that math doesn't make sense on a 4-year term when you're under pressure to get things done. So the transparency is good, the sense of endorsement, the advice and consent of the Senate, that is important. But we're really focused on trying to reduce the number of positions requiring Senate confirmation, because the Biden-Harris team managed, like, for the first time, had organized 2 teams, one to focus on the appointments, one on confirmations, had a record number of appointments, and had a successful strategy, and yet still their top leaders are experiencing more delays getting into office than the trend is getting worse for us for each successive president.
Thank you. I mean, Josie, would you be able to give us an insight into sort of how you approached this on the 2015 transition planning?
I can. The thing I wanted to say about the difference in the UK is that there's only about 125 political appointees in the UK government, and maybe add another 50 for sort of quasi civil servants who may have interest from politicians about their appointment. So we are talking about a much smaller cohort in the UK. I think the thing for me that's important is, how does an incoming government get access to the very best talent across all sectors to really drive change in government? And, I don't think that it is true that all of the best talent is, currently, to exaggerate for effect, is boys in suits in SW1. There's brilliant talent out there in the third sector, in local government, and actually with political experience as well in local government, from friends and system brother parties overseas, from business, from the third sector, etc. And so I think there's something interesting to me about how does an incoming government reach out and identify and make best use of that talent, whether that's in the political advisor context or whether that's in a wider advisory context, or SARS and people who were doing reviews, or even just partners. And I think that there's something about thinking about the 125. Yes, that's important, but if I understand Keir Starmer right, when he talks about going into government with people and with business and with civic society and all the rest of it, I think what he means is building that ecosystem of people who are actually going to make change happen, which, sorry to bang on about this, but going back to the sort of how do you think change happens in the country, if you believe that mission-led government is all about, sending a ripple out, and actually what makes change happen is not somebody in Whitehall writing a press release, and actually what makes change happen is a business person, in the West Midlands making decisions, or a, third sector leader in the Southwest doing something and making change happen for themselves. I think that is a more interesting question about how do you build that ecosystem, how do you nurture it, how do you actually make people feel like they are coming into government with you and that they are aligned behind this national mission of renewal. I think that's the big challenge.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we do actually have a follow-up from John who posed the question that relates to what you were just saying, Josie, saying that the sort of practice of management should flow from the key issue, which is the incoming government's theory of power. And he makes the point that Starmer's missions are a break from the neoliberal state, so everything should flow from that, including this kind of practice of management decisions. He also says resource is a key difference in the UK, and makes the point that we have fewer SPADs for the entire cabinet, aside from the Prime Minister and Chancellor, than he employed as Julia Gillard's comms director. So that's a sort of reality of the situation as well. We have
agree with John, rules for life.
We have another great question from an anonymous attendee who asks, did you engage with critical non-government organizations such as the Fed in the States as part of these transition preparations? So I really like this question because it's basically who do you actually speak to as part of the transition planning? Maybe I will go to Ben first for this one.
Well, the first transition planning I did, and I was the principal author, was 1999. So a little while ago, and the then opposition leader who was coming in as premier said to me, right, here's 7 really good former public servants I know who do other things as well. They're your secret source of wisdom. And literally we had this little council of elders that met 4 times, drawn from different perspectives, and never leaked, no one ever talked about it. But I didn't know anything about government. God, literally, you can do the math, I was 25. And it meant that this is a government that he then he won 3 elections in a row, partly because it was just a really good government. So this is the Bracks government in Victoria. So there are models there. Trust and confidence, discretion is really, really significant, but it does add value. But you don't want to do it at scale. You want to do it discreetly in the Australian setting. The other thing you do too is you get lots of free advice when you're doing well, right? So if you're heading the polls, everyone's knocking on the door. So part of the keeping it separate from the formal campaign, I always describe it as you're doing it in a locked room, and there's 2 doors. One door, you've got a relatively junior person who's the point of contact. Every great idea and every dumb idea, of course, there's only great ideas, goes to that single person. But they go, oh, look, I'm just very junior, but I'll take your idea and I'll feed it in. So basically, they protect the people doing the work. And then the other door is to the leader and the senior people around the leader. So you've got the mandate to do the work, and then you've got the authority to lock things in. So it's basically a locked room with 2 doors. And so, so the outreach needs to be really careful and really deliberate.
Right, okay. And Valerie, our questioner was asking in particular whether or not you spoke to organisations like the Fed in the States. I wonder if you can give us a bit of an insight into what kind of organisations you were speaking to.
So really, I feel like I represent one of those outside organizations. So the Partnership for Public Service started this work in 2008 in recognition that there was no government agency that was solely focused on continuity across administrations. And our General Services Administration is at the core of doing important work to make sure that elected candidates have the resources necessary to plan. But in terms of working across people, alumni from previous administrations, building a network of practitioners and a library of resources from, as Josie said, there are teams who have done important work that didn't get to see it fly. So to take their plans, like for us, that Mitt Romney's Readiness Project was a really outstanding guide for how to do this well. So to take those resources, collect them, that's one reason that we're here, is to help bring all of those experts together.
Josie.
Yeah, it's 2 points. One is that there are so many brilliant people out there who are so generous with their time and expertise. And those people are not just in the political Westminster bubble. They are, ex-civil servants, and they are in think tanks, and they are in the third sector and business. And the thing that everybody was worried that all of those conversations would leak, and they never did.
Right.
And so I think sometimes that when you've worked in politics, you end up being much more sort of paranoid than you probably should be, because there are lots of people out there who just want government to be done well, and if they can help, then they will. That's thing number one. And then thing number two, just building what Ben was saying about like all of these people who are providing support and advice. I think there's something really important we learned in 2015 about the commissioning process for that advice, because I think that one of the lessons was lots of people wanted to help, and maybe too many people nodded along and said, oh yeah, we definitely want 40 pages on some farming subsidy reform. And then some great, really talented, capable person would go off and spend their weekend writing it up, and then it would come back into the room, as you say, Ben, and people go, who asked for this? Why have we got this? So I think that there's some discipline and rigor that is required in activating and getting from that brilliant network and ecosystem of really smart, capable, experienced people, but being really clear about the question that you need answered, the advice that you actually need, so that you're not wasting time and you're actually getting the answer to the question that you need.
Yeah. Thank you.
I might just jump
yeah,
back,
of course.
back into initiatives, all right? One really specific example is the first 72 hours on the sort of geopolitical stuff. So you've basically got a change of government, and you have whoosh, and you've got world leaders wanting to ring up and talk to the new prime minister. Which call does he or she take first? Which call does he or she take second? You know the list, right? And that's a certain specific group of people will be able to give you that advice. So it's not just your shadow foreign secretary or foreign minister, but they need to do the rounds of consult and need to talk to the leader as well. And you can't rely on the civil service to get that right for you, because there's always nuance when there's a change of government. There's always been bilateral conversations. There's always been conversations in the shadow cabinet about prioritisation. And so it's a classic where you have to do some discrete consultation, commission up the work, bring it back in and hold it tight, particularly for that initial week.
Thank you. And I think we've got time for one more question. And this is also from an anonymous attendee. Does the current international climate of conflict and accusations, particularly in America, as to whether candidates are fit to govern, mean the stakes of transition are higher, and that swift, effective transition is more important than ever, so as not to leave a vacuum? So I think this is a really interesting question about sort of trust and being able to make a difference in a short period of time in an environment where there is a lot of polarization and mistrust of our politicians. Tom.
Thanks. I think it's very different in the three different contexts that we've looked at. The kind of polarization situation in the US is very different to it is here, despite the attempts of our conservatives to import it. But the kind of element of the question that I wanted to take on is that I do think there is an enormous amount of built-up frustration and expectation in the country.
Yeah.
And I might not go so far as to say hope for Labour, but a desire for change. And the party has made hay from suggesting it is a competent and effective party, which will be in a competent and effective government. You can trust it, and it's going to turn the country around. So in that sense, and a smooth and effective transition that gets a government that actually is able to deliver things up and running as quickly as possible is essential to Labour to keep its promise to the British people, the promise that if they do elect it, they will have elected it on. So yeah, that's my sense from the UK side.
Yeah. And Valerie, do you want to give us an insight from the US side just on that polarization point?
Yes, I think the safest, easiest way to answer that question is yes. The swift, effective, peaceful transfer of power is more important than ever. I think we certainly feel that strongly here. The events of January 6th continue to be divisive, traumatic for many, and so I think there are bright spots, good interpretations. We have a focus on the rule of law. We have excellent planning on all sides at this point for our next transition. We've done some polling that shows that Americans are at least 44% of Americans are unsure that it will be a peaceful transfer of power if there is a new candidate who wins in our election this year. That's deeply concerning. But we also see excellent planning within the Biden administration and among the challenger candidates to get ready. So there's some comfort to be taken there.
Thank you. And Josie, you were going to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this just underlines the point I was making earlier about, whereas 10 years ago we might have said, well, of course there'll be a smooth transition of power. I think if we've learned anything in the last kind of 5 years in democracies around the world, we've learned that we can't take that kind of thing for granted. And so what does that mean? It means we need to be even more on our game, and we need to be even readier, and we need to be even more professional about transition and readiness, both from the perspective of, what are you going to do, how are you going to do it? Also, one of the things we haven't really talked about is making sure that people are ready. The people are ready. They are, because being an opposition politician and being a minister are just two very different things. And so, I know there is great work being done on making sure people are ready in themselves and are supported through transition support to be able to do the job that they are being asked to do, as and get them up that learning curve as quickly as possible. And again, in any other walk of life, that would be absolutely normal and expected, and actually a dereliction of duty if you didn't do that. And so I think we should all be encouraging and supporting the idea that we should be supporting people and training people, and people aren't perfect.
Thank you. And Ben, the view from Australia on the importance of a transition that actually delivers on what the government has been promising in this sort of era that we're in.
Look, we've got compulsory voting, so our politics are not sort of anchored on either side. So I think that helps our climate. Like there's a bit of that stuff around, but people just expect this stuff to work. And when it doesn't work, that's exceptional. New governments typically in Australia get a pretty good run for at least 3 or 6 months, and they get a bit of a leave pass too when they stuff up. So it's just it's a different show.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think we've got through quite a lot, so I'm going to skip the closing remarks and just go on to thanking so much our excellent panelists, and also thank you to our audience as well. You asked some really brilliant questions, so thank you for those too. You really opened the discussion out. And you can read the full report and a blog summarising its findings and everything else about FGF and its work, including signing up to their regular newsletters at futuregovernanceforum.co.uk. And you can follow them on Twitter at FutureGovForum. And there's a second report in this 2-report series that looks at the lessons that can be learned from the 2010 UK transition. So look out for that, because that will be out soon as well. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been a fascinating discussion, and we really appreciate you all joining us from around the world as well.